Hi, everybody. This week we're going to talk about what at least I find the hardest topic to talk about in this whole class, and that is race and education and technology. And the two questions we're going to look at, the biggest question will be, how does race impact education? And the second question will be, how does technology, or can technology, help mitigate that impact, or sometimes it makes it worse. But I need to start with two disclaimers or caveats or whatever you want to call them. And the first one is that in a class like this, it's important to remember that we're always talking about generalities. We're always talking about averages. We are not predicting individuals. And it's really hard to teach about different groups of people without implying that all the people in a group are the same. But that's it's an incorrect implication, but it's also a disrespectful implication. There's nothing that makes me more angry than when people say things like, well, all women are blank, or all professors are like blank. Nobody likes to be bunched. And since we're going to be talking about ethnic groups, and all of us belong to one or more races, in a sense, and we'll get to that in my second caveat, sometimes when we talk about racial differences and racial histories and things like that, we're going to feel bunched. And I want to acknowledge that, and I want to say I wish there was a way to avoid it. But all the way through all our discussions in this class, it's really important to say and to keep in mind that when we talk about African Americans, for example, we're not talking about every single person who is African American. When we talk about white people, we're not talking about every single white person. When we talk about next week Latinos, Latinas, and Latinas and Latinxes, we're not talking about everyone with Hispanic heritage. Everybody's an individual. Our ethnicity and our race impact who we are, but of course a million other things impact who we are too. So that's my first disclaimer. My second disclaimer is that even though we're going to spend the week reading and talking and thinking about race, race is actually an extraordinarily powerful illusion. There really is no such thing as race. Modern genetics has taught us very clearly that nobody is a single race, and that in fact there are no genetic markers that distinguish clearly between races. There just is no such thing as race other than the human race. However, when I said it's an extremely powerful illusion, genetically there may not be race, but socially and politically and economically, you can bet there's race. So it's kind of interesting that we're looking at something that has no scientific fact, no basis in fact, and yet has this huge, powerful impact on people's lives. So, and more relevantly to us anyway, on their education. So given those two starts, let's take a look. When we're going to consider race and education and technology, we're going to use the African American group of people as a model case, a sample case, for a couple of very good reasons. First of all, African Americans are probably the group most impacted by the idea of race. They certainly they have a unique history in the fact that most African Americans currently in this country are descended, at least in part, from people who used to be enslaved, who were bought and sold and considered to be property. And that has had a huge impact on what has happened to the African American people in this country and continues to happen to them, and of course also as part of that on their education. Also, I'd say that there are probably only two groups in our country that are equally impacted by the idea of race, and that is African Americans and Native Americans. I would say Native Americans have definitely been impacted just as hard. However, in Georgia, the vast majority of the minority are African Americans, and so that's why we're going to look at this. If I have time, I'm going to put up an extra set of readings and things on Native Americans in this unit later. For those of you that are interested in pursuing that, I think you'll be fascinated by the history of Native American education, and I think you'll see a number of parallels, but also a number of differences between African Americans and Native Americans. Okay, so first of all, I think the first thing we need to look at is to acknowledge that there is a problem for African Americans in education. Okay, and here are some of the latest statistics on the achievement gap between African American and white people in this country, educationally speaking. You can look at any one of these statistics. You will not find a single statistic in which white people are at a disadvantage to black people. And that's pretty remarkable all by itself, the pattern of it. But also, let's take a look at some of the impacts, okay? Even as early as fourth grade, we look at the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is the gold standard. We look at math, for example, the 2017 data. African Americans score on average about a standard deviation, 25 points, below white kids who take that test. And more tellingly, if you look at the percentage who score below basic in math, only about 12% of white kids score below basic in math, a little over a tenth of them, whereas over a third of black kids score below basic. In eighth grade, you see the same pattern happening. By that time, 2/10 of white kids, but over half of black kids score below basic in math. And in 12th grade, you see the same pattern. Looking at reading, you see, if anything, a worse pattern. In 4th grade, about a fifth of white kids, 22%, score below basic, which means below basic means you're way below where you ought to be, where you need to be, but almost very close to half of black kids are below basic in reading. And the categories in NAEP, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, are below basic, basic, sorry, I forget what the third category is. It just means on level, essentially. It's not the word they use, though. It's below basic, basic, on level, and proficient. Okay, so below basic is the very lowest category. In 8th grade reading, you see similar patterns. When you look at African American poverty in the schools, about 29% of white kids qualify for free and reduced lunch in 2010, which was the latest figures I could get. Almost just about 3/4 of African American kids are poor enough that they qualify for free and reduced lunch. One of the statistics that really blows me away here is the number of kids taking the AP exam, passing the AP exam. When you look at white kids passing an AP exam, which tells you a whole lot of things. AP exams help you get into college. They mean you have to pay for less college because every AP exam that you pass, you don't have to pay for that college course. You get college credit. It gives you a leg up in college. It just means a whole lot of things. There are more than 10 times as many white kids in this country who pass an AP exam as black kids. Okay, if we look at the other statistics, okay, almost twice as many African American kids are retained, are flunk a grade essentially, are retained. 3 times plus as many are suspended. 5 times as many African American kids, percentage-wise, are expelled. We still see a digital divide in terms of the ones who have computers at home and internet access at home. and we still see a gap in terms of graduation from high school. And all the figures in the African American column that have an asterisk are the ones that indicate the African American level is the worst for all the ethnic groups that are reported on those statistics, which would include whites, Caucasians, African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, and Native Americans. Okay? So in many, many categories, African Americans have the worst educational outcomes in our country by factors of 1 or 2 or sometimes 5 or 10. So there is a problem. There is no doubt that there is a problem. The question that we tackle in part is where did this problem come from? And you had in the very first week, I think it was, a small piece of Gloria Ladson Billings talking about the educational debt, the debt that African Americans struggle under. And I need to look at this term debt. Now, one of your optionals lets you actually look at Ta-Nehisi Coates' argument for reparations to the descendants of slaves in this country, by this country. But that's not the kind of debt that Gloria Ladson Billings is talking about. She's talking about more like being in debt yourself, like being in a hole. So, for example, if you're an athlete, you know that there's such a thing as oxygen debt. When you work really hard, your muscles actually use up more oxygen than you've got. And so when you stop, you breathe really hard. You go, you're trying to make up for the oxygen you lacked. You didn't have enough. That's the kind of debt she's talking about. And it's the same like when we talk about our national debt. Okay? Our national debt is money that we're kind of in the hole. We're behind. We have to make it up to come even. And that's what she's talking about. And here on this slide, I have some of the images, the symbols of the debt. And you look at the Jim Crow laws that separated throughout the South white people from what were then called colored people, but were African American people. And of course, they separated them not just in waiting rooms and drinking fountains, but in schools, which Brown versus Board of Education in the 1950s reversed. But now, today, we find that schools are more segregated than they have been since Brown versus Board of Education. Throughout the 50s, 60s, and up through the 70s, late 70s, schools were becoming more integrated, more mixed. And then from the very late 70s, with the election of 1978, that process has begun to reverse so that schools now are more segregated than ever. So there is a long history of oppression. I have here slave manacles, and segregation in this country, and that's part of that debt. That history of oppression and segregation has led to generational poverty in African American families. The average wealth of an African American family, you remember the wealth inequality video from last week. Well, the average wealth of an African American family in this country is less than 1/5 the average wealth of the average white family in this country. Okay, African Americans, because of this long history of oppression and segregation, have not had the opportunity to build up much capital. And I will try to find an article I found on redlining that is really eye-opening about that, and I'll put it in the neat things because I didn't include it in this week's, I forgot. That generational poverty and that segregation and oppression have led to differences very often in parents' educational attainment for African American students. African American students are far more likely to be, for example, the first person in their family to go to college, a first generation person. We know that parents that are educated can support their children's education in many important ways. And again, because of this debt that Gloria Ladson Billings has been talking about, the parents' educational attainment on average in African American families is not as high. All of these things the oppression, the segregation, the poverty, the lack of educational attainment many times in the previous generation leads to lowered expectations on the part of both the family and the culture for African American students. So the family doesn't think, I mean, I don't know about you, but when I grew up, there was never a question in my family that I would go to college. The question was, which college? Okay, and the school that I attended, of my entire senior class, which was 532 people, I think there were 5 people who didn't go to a 4-year college. Okay, if you grow up in a black family, especially in a black area, that figure is perhaps reversed. So the expectations, the ideas about where you can go and who you can be, until 10 years ago, it wasn't realistic to think that if you were black, if your skin was dark, you could be president. Now it is, which is remarkable. But still, it's one president out of 34, 35, however many we've got so far. And so the expectations of yourself and the people around you, if you're an African American student, are often lower, not because of anything wrong with you, but because of this long history. And then the expectations the culture has for you are also extremely defining. And that results in ongoing acts of prejudice and harm. And I think it's really important when we're talking about this debt to acknowledge that this is not all something in the past. It's not like racism is over, you know? It goes on, and of course we've seen it in the news in the last, I'd say, 5 years. It's become much more highlighted. We have people marching in Charlotte. We have people shooting. We have police acts of shooting black men who are doing nothing, standing in their own backyard. And that's a result of these cultural expectations. It's a very tangled web. And I think that's the important thing to say. This is a long-term thing, and it's a tangled thing. And what we're talking about is racism. And that's my last symbol down here at the bottom. This is something that was the header of the Ku Klux Klan when they handed out in the Ferguson protests against the shooting of an unarmed black man in Ferguson, Missouri. The KKK handed out a manifesto about what ought to happen, and this was the symbol at the top. Okay, the traditionalist American Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. And the KKK is alive and well and living all over the place. So that's part, when we start looking at why African American kids struggle so much in education, it's not one of these things, it's all of these things. And so what we're talking about, I said we were going to talk about race and education and technology. What we're actually talking about, of course, is racism and education and technology. Okay, so, but let's look a little bit behind this. Where did this come from? And the history I'm not going to go into. You all know your American history, at least I hope so. And we've talked about poverty. But let's talk for a minute. I want to venture into psychology for a minute here about prejudice. Because prejudice is an unconscious response. It is not a reasoned thing. Prejudice is often justified by reason. Once people have a prejudice, they will seek to justify it. But it doesn't come from that. It's something that grows in you. And it's your experiences. Anyway, I want to talk about the psychological origins of prejudice and why prejudice continues to live. Why it's so difficult to stop, to put an end to. Why logic doesn't always work. In fact, hardly ever works. Okay, the psychology of prejudice. To talk about prejudice's origins and maintenance, I have to go into something called schema theory, which is a psychological theory agreed to by almost all cognitive scientists today. And that is that in our heads, we have networks of information about concepts. We have enormous interwoven networks of information. And I'm going to give you an example of a harmless, mostly, schema of my own. Here's a little bit of my schema for dog. When you say the word dog, all of these things get activated. And we actually think that we have networks in our head that are composed of neurons that somehow manage to activate all of these ideas when you say a particular word, in this case, dog. Okay, so your network, your schema, is built both from things that you know about dogs, that's what's sitting on the left-hand side right now, but also experiences you've had with dogs. So for me, when I think of dogs, okay, I have some scientific formal knowledge about dogs. I know they're related to wolves. I know there are various breeds of dogs. I know dogs have been used for many things throughout history, pets and hunting and working dogs. I know gestation is 9 weeks. I know something about diseases of dogs and vaccination of dogs. I have practical knowledge about dogs. We raised a litter of puppies, and you see a picture of that litter right there. They were very cute. Nothing is cuter than a Labrador puppy, honestly. I know about the needs of dogs. I've had dogs for years and years and years. I know how to give them good food and what kind of shelter they need. I know kind of how to train them, except I'm a softie. Okay, but all that's knowledge about dogs. But I also have knowledge of individual dogs. And there you have the puppies that we had. We've had dogs that have been my dogs. My own dear favorite Moochie, Colonel Beauregard Mooch, who was the most wonderful lab dog I've ever had in my life. Millie, who lived to 16 and a half and just died last year. Sarah, who's my current dog. My aunt's Doberman Pinschers. My aunt used to raise Dobermans. And when I was a very young child, I slept on them and teethed on them, and they were wonderful to me, so I've never been afraid of Dobermans. Brussels is a dog of a friend of mine right now. But also, humans are unique in that our schemas include not only our own experience, but vicarious experience. Stories we've been told, stories we've read, stories we've seen. Story is incredibly powerful in human beings, unlike, as far as we know, any other animal. So that I never met my mother's dog that she had when she was a child, obviously. His name was Hans, but I know of him. I watched TV shows about dogs when I was young. I didn't have a dog when I was young. My father wouldn't let me have one. So the first thing I did when I left home was get a dog. And that's because even though I'd never had a dog, I'd heard about dogs, and I watched TV shows. There's the Lassie show, which I still can't watch very easily because anytime the dog is in danger, I'm just freaked out. And Rin Tin Tin and a whole bunch of other movies and things about dogs. So all of this knowledge, both my real experiences, my vicarious experiences, the stories I've heard, and the factual knowledge I've learned, which could, by the way, be true or false, okay? But it's things that in my mind are facts. Those all go into my schema for dog. So let's back up for a minute again. We all have schemas for different racial groups. When I told you that race was an illusion, and there in your optionals, there is a very well-written piece from National Geographic talking about what genetics, current modern genetics actually tells us about the origins of humankind and how the races are not different, but how they broke off, what the history of it was. It's fascinating. But even though genetically races don't exist, we all have schemas in our heads for different groups of people. And these schemas come from things we think are facts that we've been taught or we've used, but also our own experiences, and very powerfully the experiences, the stories we've been told, both on TV, by the media, in movies, and by our parents and our grandparents. So we have a schema for a minority group, okay? We have certain beliefs, and if we are prejudiced against the minority group, prejudice simply means prejudging. You can be prejudiced for somebody, and you can be prejudiced against them, but human beings being what they are, prejudices against are much more powerful, and this is another scientific fact. Negative prejudices, negative emotions, negative experiences are much more powerful psychologically than positive ones. It's a sad thing, but true. And it's rooted in our evolutionary history. Way back when we lived in the caves and didn't have guns and things, it was a lot more important to avoid the tiger than to find the nice berry bushes. It was important to find the nice berry bushes because you didn't want to starve to death, but knowing where the tiger was really important. So the negative stuff makes a bigger psychological impact on us. Okay, so you have a schema for this minority group, perhaps a negative schema, a prejudiced schema. And one of the problems is that once we have a schema, like my schema of dog, if somebody tried to tell me now that dogs make terrible pets and that nobody should own dogs and it's, a waste of the earth's resources to spend money and food and stuff on your dog because there are starving children, which is, by the way, true, but it's not a waste, because nobody's going to convince me of that, because I have too strong a schema for dog from all of my life and experiences. Well, when we develop a schema for something, we tend to want to hold on to it. We want to continue to believe what we do believe. Sometimes it's a very small want and we can overcome it, but many times it's a very powerful want. And the reason for this is that we have to believe, to function in the world, we have to believe that most of what's in our heads is true. We have to believe that our picture of the world is a true picture, or we wouldn't dare function. We couldn't operate. Even though probably most of what's in our heads is not true, but we can't function without believing that it is. And so we get very attached to our schemas. And the longer we have them, and the more powerful they are, the more we're attached to them, the harder they are to change. This is in part, by the way, a function of age, I hate to admit. But of course, I'm an exception. Right. But there's a joke among psychologists. It's, we're not great at making jokes, so it's not a really funny joke. But that older people often suffer from hardening of the schemas. In other words, the older you get, the harder it is to change a schema. Because you've been attached to it for so long, you've run your life on it, And then to suddenly say, well, I was wrong about this big important thing about the world, that's really hard. It makes you feel like the world doesn't really exist. Some of you, when I said there really is no such thing genetically as race, that kind of rocks your world, doesn't it? Okay, so we have this schema, and the way that we preserve our schemas is that if I have a negative schema for this minority group, then when I hear more negative information, anything that confirms my schema, I will tend to remember it and accept it. So if I have a negative schema for this minority group, and then I see a member of that group acting in a negative way, I'm going to mentally say, I knew that, that's how they are, and I'm going to remember that. But if I see that a member of that minority group, or I read about it in the paper, or science comes up and tells me this isn't true, and it doesn't match my schema, I will do one of three things. I will distort it so that I don't remember what actually I read or heard. I distort it to make it fit my beliefs. And I think we've seen a lot of that in the media and the press in the last few years. Or I will forget it. I just won't remember it. Or what I'll do is I'll say, well, that was an exception. That person was exceptional. So my great uncle, Jack, was raised in Southern Illinois. Those of you who know anything about Southern Illinois know that it has nothing to do with the rest of Illinois. It's actually in the South. It's very close to Kentucky and Tennessee. And it partakes of Southern culture far more than it does of the Chicago, Northern Illinois culture. And my Uncle Jack was definitely prejudiced against black people. And so I had flaming fights with him when I was a teenager, an idealistic teenager who thought that by arguing I could change his mind, which I couldn't and didn't. But I would watch this in operation. When there was a report of a black person committing a crime in the paper, he'd say, look, see, I told you, they're all criminals. They're all just, But if he was around and I was around when Martin Luther King was marching and everything, and it was very clear that the African American, the black people marching, had enormous courage and the ability to steadfastly stick to their principles and restraint, he would just say, no, no, that's just a show. It's all put on. It's not real. And when you even talked about good people that he knew personally who were African American, they had somebody who came when my aunt was ill, a home health care aide who basically was responsible for saving my aunt's life in a sense because she got incredibly good care, and that's why she was able eventually to get back on her feet and stuff. You know, my uncle could say, well, yes, yes, Mrs. Johnson is wonderful. We're so glad to have her. She's not the usual type of black. And that's how he kept his prejudice alive. And I'm sorry to say that if it's a hurtful thing to say. I'm not trying to say hurtful things to people. But what I'm trying to say is listen for that, because you will hear it everywhere. And by the way, this applies to any prejudice one has. Okay, so that's one way that prejudice operates. And another thing that happens that makes the operation of prejudice and discrimination so powerful, besides actual acts of discrimination, like making sure that black people don't get into good schools and don't have the funding for schools that serve black kids, which is true, like not hiring black people for jobs, which happens a lot. We've done experiments where we send out resumes and the only difference is the picture attached, and black people get fewer callbacks on interviews just because of the picture. The resume is identical. We've done the same experiments, unfortunately, with teachers. And interestingly, even some African American teachers are prejudiced against African American students. They don't know it, they don't want to be, but it's there in their heads. But besides overt acts of discrimination, this is another way that prejudice continues and discrimination continues. It's called stereotype threat. You're going to watch a great video showing the experiment that really confirmed this. And what it is that if you belong to a discriminated against group, then two things happen. If you perform badly, you're seen as a representative of your group rather than just an individual. And also, you actually tend to perform worse when you're under this kind of stereotype threat. If you're worried about confirming a negative stereotype, it actually impairs your performance. So we've got some pictures here. This little cartoon is one of my favorites for gender prejudice, gender stereotyping. In math, for example, if you've got two guys sitting there and a guy's working on the board and can't figure out the problem, the other guy says, wow, you really suck at math. He doesn't say, wow, men suck at math. He just attributes this to this individual can't do math. Okay, but it is very frequent that if a woman is up there doing math and blowing it, the man will look at her and say, wow, girls suck at math. In other words, she's not just representing herself, she's representing her whole group. And that happens very strongly to minority groups in this country. Here's at the bottom right, there's a lovely reverse discrimination one. White men can't jump. There's basketball. But so you're going to see a whole movie about that. Video about that. So what happens because of all this? If you always are discriminated against, if the media, if the people around you are always telling you that your group is worse and not much is to be expected of you, and then the evidence seems to show that, you end up with an impaired self-concept. People begin to internalize that prejudice themselves. And another video that you're going to watch is a redoing by Kiri Davis, a high school girl, of the famous Clark doll experiments. And I think you'll find that very powerful, showing that prejudice, that discrimination is internalized by black children at a very early age. And so we all know in education, if you don't think you can do it, you can't do it. You have to believe you can do it to give it a shot, right? So anyway, that's what we're going to be talking about this week. And you've got a whole lot of wonderful things to watch and to read. And an amazing assortment of optionals. I mean, just really huge. And what I suggest in the optionals, because none of us in the summer have enough time to read lots and lots of extra stuff or watch lots of extra stuff, is go through, check it out, and kind of save or download or whatever the ones that interest you that maybe you want to come back to. Okay, thanks. Bye.